Well, welcome again to the program Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and I just wanted to continue to follow up on the topic we were dealing with last week, and that is the social justice warrior emphasis over at Wheaton College, my old alma mater in Wheaton, Illinois. This is the Illinois college. It's not the one up in New England. There is another Wheaton College. We're not talking about that one. We're talking about Wheaton College, the Christian Liberal Arts College in Wheaton, Illinois. And we were talking about their, in my opinion, misguided social justice warrior approach to the issues of race and gender and diversity. And there is a diversity emphasis now at Wheaton College. It's been going on for 3 or 4 years now, and I wanted to address some of the solutions that Wheaton is trying to do and implement. And I'm saying that they're taking a very one-sided approach. They're buying into a lot of the critical race theory, social justice warrior, leftist, far left, liberal, so-called progressivist mentality in dealing with these issues instead of taking a more realistic, practical, and I believe more biblical view and approach to solving these problems. But I was reading an article, and it's called Diversity Matters. It was a conversation between Rodney Sisko and Allison Ash at Wheaton College, both professors, about ethnic diversity. So let's continue on with that discussion, and hopefully we can give some meaningful content to this discussion. Rodney Stark says, students recognize we're trying to intentionally wrestle with issues of diversity and move forward. There is an anticipation about the work of the newly created position, Chief Intercultural Engagement Officer, and we're growing more racially and ethnically diverse as a staff, and that's the result of a certain type of a quota system they have now at Wheaton College, where they have diversity goals. They have quotas as far as people of color. They probably implement a system of hiring preferences. In other words, if there are two equal qualified people applying for a position, they will hire the person of color in order to bring up the quota of people of color, for example. Okay, this is all standard fare at the secular universities all across the country. And there are some really problems with these systems, and they're coming under fire not just from a biblical critique, but they're coming under fire under a secular critique. And I don't hear any of that conversation at all between these two professors, as if there were no critique of these hiring techniques, as if this is just an assumption that everyone assumes. Well, it's not. Let me go on. At the same time, we have students of color who feel that the only way they can belong is if they talk and act like a white person. If they express themselves in ways that are culturally familiar to white people, maybe at the expense of their own cultural identities, they feel that they have to be good at code switching so as to make everyone around them feel comfortable. They say things like, when can I be who I am? For many of our students, this is the first time they're encountering an understanding of themselves as coming from racial and ethnic backgrounds. Not everyone is the same, and they have to figure out what that means and how they live together. We're helping students think about being global citizens living with people different from ourselves, yet finding community. Well, there is the idea that when you come to an institution like a college as a freshman, that you are in the position of finding out how this college operates and then joining in to how this college operates. And you don't have the luxury, whether you're white or black or Asian, yellow, whatever your skin color, you have to find out how things are done there, and then you have to be a part of that community. And that means you can't always be who you are or be yourself or do whatever you want to do and then expect other people to conform to your culture. For example, if you're a student that comes from Kenya, for example, a black student that comes from Kenya, and you come to the United States and you're going to study at Wheaton College, and from your cultural perspective, who you are, what you feel comfortable with, if someone says that the event starts at 2 o'clock, but you're from Kenya, and when someone says an event starts at 2 o'clock in Kenya, that means that anywhere from 2 to 3 p.m. or 2 to 4 p.m. even, the event might actually get started and people might actually drift in and be a part of that event. So that's the Kenyan culture, and that's what you've grown up with, and that's who you are, that's who you're comfortable with. But when you come to Wheaton College, you may be rudely awakened to know that if a class starts at 2 o'clock, you actually have to be there on the money or a little before there, or else you're going to miss the class and they're going to go on without you. They're not going to wait like in Kenya where there's more flexibility with time. And that's just a cultural thing. But you as a Kenyan student cannot expect Wheaton College to conform to your culture. When you come on campus, you need to learn to conform to the Wheaton College culture in this continent. And on the North American continent, in the United States, at Wheaton College, classes start on time. And that may be a cultural thing in a predominantly white culture. I don't know. I haven't studied it. It really doesn't matter. But that's the way things are done in the United States, in the North American continent, for the most part. And you need to learn how to do that because you're the student and the college is there to help you learn. And the way they help students learn is to start classes on time. Now, that totally may be foreign to you, but you have to learn how to conform to that. I'm getting this sense from some of these groups that they don't want to do that. They don't want to conform to the dominant culture. They want to do what they feel is culturally appropriate to you. Well, that's the wrong attitude. And I think that any culture, any background, any kind of, even a subculture, could play that card and say, hey, this is not who I am. You're making me conform to what you are and not let me be who I am. And that's just silly. You need to be flexible. You need to learn how to be a part of the community that you're in and not expect that community to conform to the ways that you're used to. So I understand what he's saying to some degree, but then another time I think it's very offensive when he talks about sometimes the African American students feel like they have to be white people. You know, again, I think that kind of language is highly offensive. I think that is potentially inflammatory when you start tossing around skin colors like that. I mean, I don't think Wheaton College does that. When I went to college, you didn't hear people talking about black people and white people and red people and yellow people and all these kind of peoples. It was like we're all together. And we didn't use this kind of language. And this language, I think, is divisive. I think it's really inflammatory. I think this really causes more trouble than is really helpful. So again, here's an example of what I think is something that is supposed to be a progressive, we've come this far kind of a thing, that now you can toss around terms like white people and I feel like a white person or a black person or whatever. And I don't think that's progress. I think that's regress. I think that's going the wrong way. I think that's putting race too much in the forefront and focusing on race and talking too much about skin color and all these kind of things that divide people. So what they call progress, I think in some ways is regress. And so we've got to learn how to do things different, like not just follow along the SJW ideology. It says, Allison Ash then responds, I see the climate here in layers. The first is the formal institutional layer. I've seen progress as institutional decisions like the search for Chief Intercultural Engagement Officer. But when I hear what students are experiencing, that's still the most challenging. When there's unawareness, there's a real possibility of hurting people. For example, when a godly, Christ-centered person says something like, I love your hair, and touches an African-American woman's hair, without an understanding of why that may be offensive, a person may be unknowingly hurting someone. That can be problematic, especially if someone has experienced that every day living in a white community. It creates a difficult environment. Educational research shows that some of sense of belonging is one of the most important predictors of being successful in school. One comment, hour after hour, day after day, creates a climate for students of color to say, do I actually belong here? And other impacts, and that impacts the student's ability to thrive. We're making progress through developing training programs for student leaders, staff, and adding diversity requirements in the curriculum. I'm hoping that we will continue to improve. And these are examples, for example, that example of some student complimenting an African-American students on their hair. That can be seen as a, quote, microaggression. And again, wow, that's amazing that that kind of a experience can be seen as something negative. When someone compliments you on your hair and you're offended by that compliment of your hair because you think it's coming from some bad place, or you're offended by it because you're sensitive to something. I don't know. There's something that is wrong there. And I think if you encourage this talk about microaggressions and you encourage getting out the magnifying glass and you start looking at every single thing said and done and gesture and look, and if you start doing that, you're going to find all kinds of stuff. And it's not just people of color being offended. If you're going to open that can of worms, you're going to get so many people claiming victim status on campus of Wheaton College. You're going to spend all your time sharing and recording and reporting students' experiences of this slight and that slight and this offense and that offense and this microaggression and that microaggression. I really think we're running down the wrong path in this direction. And yet Wheaton College seems to be really committed to this path. But hopefully someone will hit the brakes and say, well, wait a minute, let's back up and look at what we're really starting, because do we really want to go down this path of microaggressions? I think it's a bottomless pit. You're never, ever going to get anywhere when you start doing that. So Rodney Stark then comments, yes, we are in this together. I want Wheaton to grow to be a safe place where students of color are challenged and supported, and where ethnic majority students are encouraged to engage with diversity. But that's not going to happen through a single person of color, a person in a student development position, or only student development thinking about it. We have to think about it in all our responsibilities, encouraging each other as we recognize our different cultural backgrounds. And I say amen to that. We need to be a loving community. But why do you need to use the secular categories and vocabulary, and why do you need to use the secular tools and methodologies to do this, when a lot of times it's probably the case that those methodologies and tools are actually harming things more than helping? Why can't we just talk in terms of love? Why can't we go to 1 Corinthians 13 and talk about the characteristics of love? And what does that mean in a college community? And why can't we talk about in terms of biblical teachings and use biblical examples and draw biblical principles? Why do we have to go out into the secular world and use their tools and their methodologies, baptize them with language that sounds Christian, and think we're doing something great? I think the problem here is that these tools of the secular world and the critical race theory and the identity politics and the social justice warrior language and categories are being inappropriately used by Wheaton College in addressing a legitimate concern. And the legitimate concern is, how do we build a peaceful, thriving community with people from all kinds of different backgrounds? And I think that Wheaton College has the resources biblically to do this without borrowing from the left. We don't have to join the Democratic Party to feel like we're making progress on this. We can solve these problems in more consistent Christian ways than just simply adopting them from the Democratic National Committee's platform. So we need to go deeper than that. Rodney Stark says, Allison Ash says, I remember being at a diversity conference in New York representing Wheaton. And Rodney, you said, I used to be the only person coming to these, and now I have all my colleagues here with me. And then Rodney Stark says, that's a shared sense of responsibility. We get to do this together, and there's something empowering about that. We've grown because of that shared responsibility and because we haven't given up. So these two were at a diversity conference in New York. My question is, who sponsored the diversity conference and what was being presented at the diversity conference? And who are the presenters and what was their take and how did they approach these issues? If it was a leftist, radical, liberal, social justice warrior, critical race theory, neo-Marxist social analysis perspective, then no, it's not helpful. It's not something that we should be sending our professors to. It's not something that we should be aligning with. So, yeah, there needs to be some thought about this. There needs to be some discussion and reflection on how we go about solving our problems. Are we going to go about them in an authentic biblical manner? Are we going to use the language of the Bible? Are we going to go to Bible passages that God teaches us from? Are we going to go to Karl Marx, find out what he says, and then say, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Let's do that. And then adopt the neo-Marxist categories? That's wrong. That's misguided. That's what they did in liberation theology. That's what they did down in Latin America. And it basically tried to hijack Christianity for political ends. And they're still trying to fight that and the negative effects of that down in Latin America. I think the worst of the liberation theology is over, thank God, and that this distortion that came into the church through political ideology, economic analysis is mostly on the way out down in Latin America, but here in the United States, especially at Christian institutions and colleges, it's almost as if they have just discovered this. They're always seem to be about 20, 30 years behind. It's like Wheaton College, wow, we didn't realize that there were these categories of social analysis, and wow, these are so cool. Let's buy into this. It's the same way with my old alma mater, graduate school alma mater, Fuller Theological Seminary, where I got my doctorate at. They're too joining the social justice warrior movement, and they're talking in terms of this, where you have students now giving speeches on they're not feeling safe at Fuller Seminary. They don't feel it's a white space, and they don't feel safe in white spaces at Fuller Seminary, and all this kind of rhetoric. And I wouldn't be surprised at Wheaton College that they're not using that terminology too. They're talking, I can imagine a social justice warrior looking around Wheaton College campus and says, "This is a white space. I don't feel safe here." And then there's a Office of Intercultural Engagement that's brought in and to solve all of these problems. And I think the biggest problem is that when you look at the world through a Marxist lens, through a social justice warrior lens, you're going to find problems that actually aren't there. And then your solutions are going to create more problems than they actually solve. So Allison Ashen goes ahead. "I think if someone else wrote your chapter on why they stayed, that person would say that the reason we've been doing any of this work is because Rodney stayed and just kept going. God has gifted you to do the things not a lot of people would do. And we're reaping the benefits. We still have a long way to go, but we're in a different place now than even when I came about 5 years ago." They are in a different place, but unfortunately, it's a leftist place. It's a radical liberal place, and they're taking the wrong approach to legitimate concerns, and they're buying into this social justice warrior mentality, and it's actually sad to see, because they're acting like, for example, this Rodney Stark, he's had to suffer a lot, but he stayed through it all. And I don't really understand that, and I would like to really understand what his definition of suffering is. Because when you look at suffering all around the world, and you look at the problems that a lot of the people in the world face, I don't think anyone on the campus of Wheaton College for the last decades and decades has actually been in a place where they could say, "Oh, we've been suffering here. We've been suffering here." That seems a very far-fetched statement. Rodney Stark says, "It's important we understand unique stories and recognize that we see our stories through our own cultural eyes. But I never want to lose sight of the fact that we are still called to unity." That's right, we're still called to unity. In the book of Revelation, John has a vision where he looks and he sees every tribe, every nation together. Yes, he does. And the focus of that meeting in Revelation that he's referring to is not the people and not their ethnic diversity, but the focus is on God. So they get their eyes on God and not on their own identity, and not on their own ethnic identity, and not on their own politics, and not on their own categories, and they're not thinking about microaggressions and macroaggressions. They're thinking about God, and they're focusing their thoughts on God. And as students, I would recommend focus on getting a good education in the biblical Christian worldview, and get your eyes off yourself and stop looking around and looking for people that have offended you and looking for grievances, and put your own ethnic and tribal identity off to the side a little bit, whether you're white, black, yellow, red, or whatever, and just focus on getting a good Christian education, and you will get one. Allison Ash says, "Jesus brought reconciliation, a power among people groups." A power, there we go. In the New Testament, we see that Jews often assume both religious and ethnic power. But the Gentiles were full members of the body of Christ through Christ. We are all unified, but not because we are supposed to be uniform. Our Christian unity is because of the work of the cross. That's why I think that this work of reconciliation is foundational to the gospel. reconciliation with God is the foundation of the gospel, and then it flows from our reconciliation with God, reconciliation with other people. But it doesn't come through this, quote, racial reconciliation movement within the social justice warrior mentality. That's a whole foreign other thing. When Christians reflect this kind of Christian unity, we see important and powerful work Jesus did to name the equality of power across ethnicity and race and the salvation that's offered to all people. I don't know where she gets this. She snuck in this equality of power across ethnicity and race. Jesus talked about salvation, but she's trying to pull Jesus into that social justice warrior camp, and he's just not going. And I think there's no better place to see this happen and be successful than in Christian higher education. And Rodney Stark says, it's an exciting work for us to wrestle intentionally with how to create a community that is diversity, yet holding to the high values of unity. Diversity helps us recognize the complexity of our God. Christ prayed that we were one. We're a great multitude from every nation, tribe, and people and language standing together and worshiping the Lamb. That's right. And we need to not get bogged down and distracted by all of this social justice warrior, microaggression, patriarchy, gender parity. Oh man, you can go on with all of these phrases and terminologies. We are there at Wheaton College, if you're a student, to get a godly, Christ-like education, a biblical worldview. And you don't want to get distracted by all this political, ideologically driven social justice warrior mentality that actually is contrary to the kind of community that the Bible outlines. The Bible outlines that we are reconciled first and foremost as sinners to God through Jesus Christ. And then from that relationship, we are made one in Christ. So then we go and we learn how to love one another. And it's not as complicated as the social justice warrior, neo-Marxist critical analysis makes it. And I think that if Wheaton College just simply focuses on being Christian and teaching biblical teachings in chapel and stop beating people up because they're white and stop seeing things through the neo-Marxist lenses and through the social justice warrior categories and just be about being Christians, then a lot of the problems that face society can be solved. But when you start bringing in these secular, foreign to the Bible categories, you're really stirring up more trouble than you are solving problems. So let's pray for Wheaton. I hope that's helped, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.